She was a billionaire single mother, powerful, respected, untouchable. Yet one night she sat trembling, holding a piece of paper filled with codes that her entire team of experts could not break. Just when she thought all was lost, the most unlikely man stepped forward, a homeless wanderer everyone else ignored. In minutes, he translated the code and revealed a secret that could destroy her empire. But what she chose to do 1 week later with this same homeless man will shock you to your core. Clara Williams pressed the thin paper against her palm as if squeezing harder would reveal its meaning. She sat in the back of her Bentley, the leather seats hugging her like a throne. But for once, the throne gave her no comfort. She had built Williams Tech into one of the largest cybersecurity firms in Africa. Politicians, billionaires, even foreign governments trusted her algorithms. She was the woman people pointed at and whispered, "She's untouchable." But tonight she felt vulnerable. Her IT team had tried for hours and failed to explain the strange rows of symbols and numbers. The letter had been slipped under her windshield inside the company compound, a violation itself. Someone had walked past guards, past cameras, and left her a puzzle she could not solve. Her driver stood by the open door. "Madam, maybe we should call the police." Clara's jaw tightened. The police. She remembered their uselessness when her father died years ago, and greedy relatives threw her and her mother into the streets. No, not the police. She had learned early in life that power protected itself. A gravelly voice broke through the night. "I can read that." She lifted her head sharply. By the compound wall, slumped against cardboard, sat a man whose very presence should have been invisible. Unshaven beard, a torn coat, eyes shadowed from nights without sleep. A brown bag lay at his side, thin as if it carried only memories. Her driver snapped, "Get away before I—" But the man didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the page in Clara's hand. They were not the eyes of a beggar. They were sharp, intelligent, familiar even, though she couldn't place why. "That's not random," he said calmly. "It's a cipher. Whoever wrote it wants you to know something." Clara's instinct was to laugh. Her security team, her analysts, even her boardroom of experts couldn't make sense of it. And here was a man who probably hadn't had a shower in months claiming he could. But then, wasn't that the way her life had always been? Salvation from the least expected places? She thought of the mechanic under the bridge who once handed her a bottle of water and gave her a chance at life. She stepped closer, against every rule of caution. "And you? What could you possibly know about codes?" The man's cracked lips curled into the faintest smile. "Enough to know that you should be afraid." Something inside Clara's chest tightened. Against reason, against pride, she extended the page. The man took it with surprising care, his finger tracing each line as if the symbols were old friends. He whispered numbers under his breath, his brows furrowing, and then he looked up. "They're going to attack in 1 week," he said softly. "Everything you own, everything you built, gone, unless you stop it." The night seemed to hold its breath. Clara froze. Her driver muttered angrily, but she barely heard him, because deep inside Clara felt it. This man wasn't guessing. Somehow, impossibly, he was telling the truth. And for reasons she could not yet explain, she didn't turn him away. Clara hadn't planned to speak to him again. The idea of letting a stranger, much less a homeless man, into her world went against every instinct that had kept her alive this long. Yet by the time her driver rolled through the mansion gates, the coded paper felt heavier than gold in her purse, and her mind kept replaying the stranger's certainty. 1 week. Everything you built. Gone. That night, she sat in the living room surrounded by her security chiefs, analysts, and lawyers. The page lay on the coffee table like a curse. They argued, each voice louder than the last, but none offered solutions. Her son's voice cut through the noise. "Mom, why are they shouting?" Ethan's wheelchair squeaked as he rolled closer, his big eyes blinking at the scene. At 7, he was already too wise, too observant for his age. His accident at 4 had stolen his ability to walk, but it hadn't dimmed the fire in his mind. Clara rushed to him, kneeling. "It's nothing, baby, just business." "Then why do you look afraid?" he asked softly. The question pierced her. She remembered holding him as a newborn, promising he would never feel the fear she had felt as a child. Promises were fragile things. She knew that too well. She dismissed the staff and sat staring at the paper long after midnight. Finally, against reason, she ordered her driver to return to the company lot. The man was still there, curled against the wall, his breath visible in the cool air. When she approached, his eyes opened immediately, as though he had been awake the whole time. "Why did you come back?" he asked. Clara hesitated. "Because I think you know something I need." He studied her carefully, then nodded. "Then give me a chance to prove it." The next day she set him at a small desk in her mansion's sitting room with a borrowed laptop. Her staff gossiped, whispering about the madman she had brought inside. She ignored them. She had learned long ago never to measure people by appearances, not after she had been the little girl in torn sandals, begging strangers for food. As David worked, Ethan wheeled himself in. He stopped a few feet away, watching curiously. "Who are you?" David looked up, startled. "Just someone trying to help your mom. You don't look like the people she usually works with." Ethan's voice was innocent but direct. David chuckled softly. "That's because I'm not like them." The boy wheeled closer, peeking at the laptop. "What are you doing?" "Trying to catch bad people before they hurt good people," David answered. Ethan tilted his head. "Are you good?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, pain flickered across his face. Memories of children lost, of a wife who had walked away. He forced a smile. "I'm trying to be." From the doorway, Clara watched the exchange, her chest tightening. It was the first time she'd seen Ethan initiate conversation with anyone outside the staff in months. Something about the man drew her son in, something she couldn't explain. And though every warning in her head screamed she was making a mistake, Clara decided not to stop it. The mansion was always full of people, but strangely empty. Guards, maids, drivers, assistants, all moved with precision, but none filled the silence Clara carried inside. Since her husband's death, even her son's laughter had become rare. That afternoon, David sat hunched over the laptop Clara had given him, his fingers surprisingly nimble on the keys despite the dirt under his nails. He muttered sequences, pausing only to scribble notes on scrap paper. Ethan wheeled himself into the sitting room, curiosity in his eyes. "Are you still chasing the bad people?" Ethan asked. David looked up and his face softened. "Yes, but don't worry. We'll catch them." The boy wheeled closer, eyes scanning the screen. "I don't understand any of that." "You don't need to," David said with a small smile. "You just need to believe we'll win." Clara, passing through, paused at the doorway. She watched them. The way David's tone shifted around Ethan, how patient he became, how he met the child's questions with dignity instead of dismissal. Most adults spoke to Ethan as though his wheelchair defined him, but not David. Later that evening, the maid brought Ethan's dinner, a plate of rice and vegetables. She placed it on the table beside him, but the boy's small hands trembled as he tried to lift the spoon. The accident 3 years ago had left more than his legs weakened. Clara had spent countless nights replaying that day, the screech of tires, the sound of his cries, the doctors shaking their heads. A miracle might come someday, they had said. She had clung to that word like a lifeline. Now she watched her son struggle, lips pressed tight. "I don't want to eat," Ethan muttered, pushing the plate away. The maid sighed helplessly. "Madam will be angry if you don't eat." Before Clara could intervene, David closed the laptop and rose. He walked over slowly, crouching to Ethan's level. "You're not hungry, or it's just hard today?" Ethan avoided his gaze. "Hard." David picked up the spoon, scooped a small bite, and held it gently. "Then let me help. Just today. Tomorrow you'll be stronger." The boy hesitated, then opened his mouth. David fed him carefully, speaking softly between bites. "You know, when I was your age, I hated being helped. I wanted to prove I was strong, but sometimes strength is letting someone care for you." A small smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "No one talks to me like that." David chuckled. "Then maybe you've been talking to the wrong people." Clara stood frozen in the hallway, her hand gripping the doorframe. She had seen therapists, doctors, teachers. None had reached Ethan this way. And now, a homeless man with nothing but scars and worn clothes sat feeding her son, making him laugh between bites. Then she heard it, a word that made her chest ache. Ethan looked up at David and whispered, "Thanks, Dad." Clara's breath caught. Tears blurred her vision. She pressed a hand over her mouth, afraid to break the moment. Her son, who had never once called another man father since her husband's death, had chosen this stranger. Something deep inside Clara shifted. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a cruel word. That night, Clara lay awake in her king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling while the echoes of Ethan's small voice haunted her. "Thanks, Dad." The word had pierced her like a blade and healed her like a balm all at once. She pressed her hand over her chest, fighting the rush of emotions. How could a man with nothing reach into the deepest wound of her son's heart, and hers, with such ease? Sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories dragged her backward, pulling her into the shadows of a past she rarely allowed herself to revisit. She was 10 again, clinging to her father's hand as he promised they would be safe. Then came the accident. Screeching metal, a crushed car, her father's lifeless body. The relatives descended like vultures before the funeral was over. They called her mother cursed, accused them of bringing bad luck, and seized every property her father had left behind. Clara remembered standing barefoot at the gate of the mansion that had once been her home, clutching her pregnant mother's skirt, as they were shoved into the street with nothing but tears. Hunger and shame became her companions. Her mother hawked oranges by day, sold pure water in traffic by night. Clara followed her, balancing trays on her small head, pretending she wasn't tired. But she remembered her mother's labored breathing, the way she winced when the baby kicked. The night her mother went into labor, Clara thought she would die. They had no money, but a kind taxi driver rushed them to the hospital. The doctor, a gentle man with tired eyes, examined her mother and shook his head. "The baby is in the wrong position. She'll need surgery. Without it..." Clara dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please, save her. I'll do anything. She's all I have." Something in the doctor's heart softened. He performed the surgery without payment. Her mother survived, her baby brother survived. For a brief moment, hope returned. The doctor even brought them home, paid Clara's school fees, and filled their bellies with food. But safety never lasted. The doctor's wife hated them. Clara could still see the woman's cold eyes, hear the venom in her voice. Strays don't belong here. What Clara didn't know then was the woman's secret, an affair with her husband's best friend, and a plan to silence him forever. 5 months later, the doctor was dead in a staged car accident, his brakes tampered with by a bribed mechanic. At his burial, his wife wasted no time. She ordered Clara's family out. Back on the streets, desperation forced Clara's mother into a decision that scarred them all. A woman approached, whispering about a barren billionaire desperate for a child. For money, her mother sold her newborn baby boy. Clara had begged, screamed, but the deal was done. With the cash, her mother rented a room, started a food stall, and sent Clara to a public school. Then fate struck again. One evening, Clara's mother was hit by a speeding car, dead on the spot. Clara was left with nothing. No father, no mother, no baby brother. Just a one-room apartment she couldn't afford, and a hunger that hollowed her bones. She dropped out of school, begged for food, slept under bridges, and learned to ignore pitying stares. Now, lying in her mansion, Clara pressed her hands against her face, tears hot on her cheeks. Watching David feed Ethan earlier had unlocked everything. The way he spoke gently, the way he listened. It reminded her of the doctor who had once saved her mother, of the mechanic who had once shown her mercy under a bridge. And for the first time, Clara realized something terrifying. Perhaps this man, this homeless stranger, was not an accident in her life. Perhaps he was another turning point. Down the hall, she heard Ethan's faint laughter drifting from his room, carried by the memory of David's presence. Clara closed her eyes and whispered into the silence, "God, what are you trying to show me?" David sat at the desk Clara had given him, the glow of the laptop reflecting in his tired eyes. Rows of numbers danced across the screen, but his focus wavered. Behind him, faintly, he could hear Ethan's laughter drifting down the hall. It stirred something he hadn't felt in years, something both beautiful and painful. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and let the past wash over him. He was an infant again, wrapped in a faded cloth, left in a basket at the doorstep of a humble parsonage. He could almost hear the gasp of the pastor's wife when she opened the door that fateful morning. "Samuel, come quickly," she had cried. The pastor had stepped out, eyes widening at the sight of the tiny bundle. Inside was a newborn with a note scrawled in hurried ink. "I cannot raise him. Forgive me." The couple, childless for years, took him in. They named him David. At the police station, papers were filed, and before long the child no one wanted became theirs legally. David grew up in that small house, the smell of wood polish and hymn books filling his memories. His adoptive mother taught him to pray before meals. His father taught him to read scripture by candlelight. By the time he was 10, David was different. When children in the village fell sick, he laid hands on them and prayed, and sometimes, not always, but enough to be noticed, they recovered faster than doctors expected. Whispers spread, "That boy has a gift." But blessings carried shadows. When David was 23, both his adoptive parents fell ill, one after the other. He prayed, begged God, but this time the healing did not come. Within months, he buried the only parents he had ever known. Standing over their graves, the hymns echoing in his ears, he promised he would live as they had taught him, with faith. For a while he did. He married a young woman named Miriam, full of laughter and fire. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. His home was filled with the very love he had once known in the parsonage. But tragedy returned like an old thief. A sudden illness struck his children. He prayed until his knees bled, but they slipped away, one after the other. Miriam broke under the weight of grief. When a wealthy man noticed her beauty and offered her escape, she left without looking back. David lost his family, his work, his home, everything. He wandered the streets, a hollow man clutching memories, ashamed of the prayers that had once brought miracles, but now seemed to mock him. A knock at the door snapped him back to the present. Ethan wheeled in, holding a chessboard. "Do you play?" the boy asked shyly. David smiled faintly. "I used to." As he began setting the pieces with Ethan, he felt the strangest sensation, as though the laughter of his own lost children was echoing in the boy's voice. From the hallway, Clara paused, unseen, watching the two. She saw not just a homeless man and her crippled son, but something deeper. A bond forming, stitched by pain and perhaps by destiny. David had never been a man of many words, but in Clara's home, silence seemed to carry weight. Each morning after Ethan's breakfast, he lingered by the boy's chair, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. His lips moved, whispering prayers too soft for Clara to catch. She noticed, though. From the corner of her eye, she saw his hands, roughened by years of street survival, resting lightly on her son's frail frame. One afternoon, as she passed by, she asked, "What are you saying over him?" David looked up, calm and unashamed. "I'm asking God to do what doctors couldn't." Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell him miracles were fairy tales she could no longer afford to believe. Yet a small voice inside reminded her of her own survival. The taxi driver who had rushed her mother to the hospital, the doctor who had cut through skin and bone to save a life without a shilling. Wasn't that, in its own way, a miracle too? That night, Ethan wheeled into the study where David worked on the laptop. "Do you think I'll ever walk again?" the boy asked. His voice trembled, not with childish hope, but with the aching knowledge of disappointment too often repeated. David closed the laptop and knelt in front of him. "I believe you will, not because of me, but because God hasn't forgotten you." Ethan's eyes glistened. "But I've prayed before. Nothing happened." David swallowed hard. The words dragged him back to the graves of his children, to nights of unanswered prayers. He forced a steady voice. "Sometimes answers take longer than we want, but they come." The boy nodded slowly, as though clinging to a rope that might snap any second. Days passed. Each morning, David prayed. Each night, Clara wrestled with herself. Logic told her she was foolish to allow this man into her home. Yet every time she saw Ethan laugh at David's jokes, every time she saw her son's shoulders relax in his presence, she knew there was something more here than she understood. Then came the day that would change everything. Ethan had just finished dinner, and David, as always, fed him the last bites when his hand shook too much. Afterward, David placed a hand on his legs, whispering a prayer longer than usual. Clara, passing by, paused unseen in the hallway. "Father," David whispered, voice cracking, "this child has carried pain enough. If you ever listen to me, listen now." Ethan gasped suddenly. His legs twitched beneath the blanket. He looked down, eyes wide. The muscles spasmed again, stronger this time. David's hand gripped tighter, his voice louder, urgent. Then, in a moment that felt suspended outside of time, Ethan pushed against the arms of his chair. His knees trembled, his feet pressed against the floor, and he stood. For the first time in 3 years, the boy stood on his own legs. Clara's hands flew to her mouth. A sob broke out of her as Ethan, unsteady but determined, stumbled toward her, crying, "Mommy, look, I can walk." Tears blurred her vision as she caught him in her arms. She looked over his head at David, who was still kneeling, tears streaming down his face. And in that moment, Clara knew her world had just shifted forever. The house had never felt so alive. Word of Ethan's first steps spread quickly among the staff. Guards whispered it by the gate. Maids passed it in the kitchen like a secret too radiant to contain. But for Clara, it wasn't gossip. It was raw, undeniable reality. Her son had walked. She had seen it with her own eyes, felt the trembling weight of his body when he stumbled into her arms. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Clara sat alone in the living room. The chandelier above her glowed softly, but her mind was in shadows. She poured herself a glass of wine and stared at the reflection on the polished table. "How?" she whispered to herself. She had the best doctors, specialists flown in from London and Dubai. Each one had given the same grim answer. Wait for a miracle, but don't expect one. And now, a homeless man with nothing but worn clothes and tired eyes had prayed, and it had happened. Her mind reeled back to her own childhood. She remembered the doctor who had saved her mother and brother without a coin in return. She remembered the mechanic who taught her under the bridge. Kindness and salvation had always come to her from those the world ignored. Now here was David, another man discarded by society, breathing life into her home. She heard footsteps and turned. David stood at the edge of the room, uncertain if he should enter. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes carried a strange peace. "You should be resting," Clara said softly. He hesitated. "I wanted to make sure Ethan is comfortable. He fell asleep quickly tonight." Clara set her glass down, studying him. "You prayed for him, every day. Why?" David lowered his gaze, his voice rough. Because I saw myself in him, broken, waiting for someone to believe I wasn't finished yet. He paused, his hands tightening into fists. And because I couldn't save my own children. The raw honesty in his words pierced her. Clara's throat tightened. She rose slowly, crossing the room until she stood a breath away from him. For the first time, she noticed the small scars on his hands, the way he carried grief like a hidden weight. "You've given my son something I thought was gone forever," she whispered. "Hope." David shook his head. "Not me. God." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Two souls scarred by loss, bound together by a miracle neither could explain. Clara felt something stirring inside her, something she had buried since her husband's death. "David," she said at last, her voice trembling. "Maybe you came here for more than just the code." He looked at her, startled, as though the thought had never crossed his mind. From down the hall, Ethan's sleepy voice called out, "Good night, Dad." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She turned back to David, her heart thundering. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking like a CEO or a billionaire. She was thinking like a woman, like a mother who had just glimpsed the impossible. And in that fragile silence, the seed of her shocking decision began to take root. A week passed, but the air in Clara's mansion never settled back to normal. Every time Ethan walked, even just a few steps before tumbling into laughter, the staff stopped to watch. They whispered miracle in hushed tones, crossing themselves as if afraid the blessing might vanish if spoken too loudly. David stayed mostly quiet through it all. He kept working on Clara's laptop, analyzing the codes, feeding Ethan when his hands trembled, and praying in silence each night. But Clara noticed the way he always packed his bag at the end of the day, as though reminding himself this was temporary. On the 7th evening, she couldn't bear it anymore. She told him, "Tomorrow, meet me at La Couronne by 7. David blinked, unsure. "The restaurant? That's not for people like me." Clara's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Tomorrow, it will be." La Couronne glowed with golden chandeliers and mirrored walls, the kind of place reserved for billionaires and ministers. That night, every eye turned as Clara Williams entered, dressed in deep emerald silk, her son by her side in a sharp little suit, walking carefully but proudly. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Everyone had heard Ethan was crippled. Now he walked with shaky grace, clutching his mother's hand. David trailed behind them in a borrowed suit Clara's staff had pressed for him. He felt the stares, pity from some, disdain from others. But when Ethan saw him and grinned, "Dad, sit by me," the weight on his chest lifted. Dinner passed with quiet conversation. David kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. He assumed Clara was here to thank him, maybe to offer him money and a goodbye wrapped in politeness. That was the kind of ending life had always given him. But when dessert was cleared, Clara stood. The room hushed. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. Then, to everyone's shock, she walked to David's chair and sank to her knees. Gasps erupted around the room. A billionaire woman, kneeling in public? "David Okoro," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "You came into my life as a stranger everyone else overlooked. You gave my son back his joy, his legs, his laughter. You gave me hope when I thought I'd buried it with my husband. And now, I don't want a future without you. Will you marry me?" David's breath caught. His eyes blurred with tears. He reached down, lifted her gently to her feet, then took the box from her trembling hands. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it, revealed the diamond ring. And then, to the astonishment of all, he dropped to his knees instead. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Not like this. Let me do it right." The room was silent, save for the thundering of Clara's heart. He looked up at her through tears. "Clara Williams, will you marry me?" She nodded, choking on sobs. Their hands clasped, their lips met, and the restaurant erupted in cheers. Ethan clapped loudly from his seat, beaming. And just like that, the story of a billionaire and a homeless man had turned into something neither of them could have imagined. 2 weeks after the proposal, the mansion gates opened to a quieter kind of celebration. Clara had refused a spectacle. No cameras, no journalists. She wanted this moment pure, untouched by headlines. Beneath a canopy of white roses in the garden, she stood in a gown of simple elegance, holding Ethan's hand as he walked steadily down the aisle beside her. Every step her son took felt like another vow fulfilled. David stood waiting at the altar, his suit modest but his eyes glowing with something deeper than pride. For a man who had once slept under bridges, this moment felt unreal, like waking into a dream he had never dared pray for. As vows were exchanged, Ethan clutched both their hands and whispered, "Now I really have a dad again." Clara wept openly, unashamed. She had once thought her son would never walk, never laugh like this again. And here they were, a family reborn. The reception was small but warm. Staff who had once doubted David now clapped his back, whispering blessings. Clara's closest friends, once skeptical, watched in quiet awe. But even as music played and laughter filled the night, Clara's gaze sometimes drifted beyond the lights, back into darker corridors of memory. Later, when the guests had gone, she sat with David on the balcony, overlooking the city skyline. Her hand rested in his, but her eyes were hard. "There's something you need to know," she said. David turned, sensing the weight in her tone. "My father's relatives," she whispered. "The ones who threw us into the streets. They're still out there, wealthy, untouched. They built their empire on the ruins of ours, and every day they walk free while my mother's body lies in the ground." David's jaw tightened. Then it's time they answer for what they did. Clara hesitated. She had built her life on survival, not revenge. But seeing David's conviction, she felt strength she hadn't allowed herself in years. For too long, those who had wronged her had lived without consequence. That was about to change. The plan unfolded quietly. Clara used her company's resources to dig deep into her relatives' dealings. What they found was damning. Fraud, embezzlement, land theft, corruption that stretched through decades. David, once a cryptographer, pieced the evidence together like a puzzle, each document another nail in the coffin of the people who had destroyed her childhood. When the file was complete, Clara handed it to the authorities. "Make sure they can't buy their way out," she said coldly. The arrests came swiftly. News cameras captured the once proud relatives in handcuffs, their empire crumbling under the weight of evidence. For Clara, it wasn't just justice, it was closure. Standing beside David as the reports aired, she whispered, "They stole my childhood, but they won't steal my son's future." David wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "No one will take that from you again." Clara leaned against him, her heart finally lighter. For the first time in her life, justice hadn't slipped through her fingers. With David by her side, she had taken back what was stolen and built something stronger in its place. The morning after her relatives were hauled away in handcuffs, Clara stood on the balcony with David, the city humming below them. Victory should have tasted sweet, but a shadow still lingered in her chest. "There's more," she said quietly. David turned to her, brow furrowed. "When I was a girl after my father died, a doctor saved my mother and baby brother. He gave us food, shelter, and sent me back to school. He was the only man who showed us kindness." Her voice cracked. But his wife? She was having an affair with his best friend. Together they bribed a mechanic, tampered with his brakes, and killed him. The day after his burial, she threw us back into the streets. David's jaw tightened, fury burning in his eyes. "And they're still free?" "Yes," Clara whispered, living off the wealth that should have gone to his children. She killed the man who saved us. Sometimes I think her cruelty hurt worse than the accident that killed my father. David took her hand, steady and firm. Then it's time they answer too. For him. For your mother. For the little girl who lost everything that night. Clara exhaled, years of grief pressing against her chest. She nodded. Together they began digging. David's cryptographer mind sifted through records, tracing financial trails long buried. Clara leaned on her company's investigators. Slowly, a web of corruption unraveled. Land deeds shifted after the doctor's death, forged signatures, funds siphoned into shell companies owned by the doctor's wife and her lover. The deeper they dug, the uglier it grew. They discovered the affair had lasted decades, the lover profiting from contracts originally meant for the doctor's hospital. Worse still, testimonies from old staff revealed how the wife had boasted of her victory, claiming she had secured her wealth through cunning. Clara's chest burned as she read the reports. She remembered being 10 years old, standing in that woman's kitchen, her small hands clutching a school book while the woman hissed, "Strays don't belong here." David placed the final file on her desk. "It's all here. Enough to bury them." Clara stared at the evidence, her hands trembling. "It won't bring him back," she whispered. "No," David said softly, "but it will bring peace, and maybe his soul will rest easier knowing his killers finally paid." When the case hit the courts, the scandal exploded. Headlines screamed betrayal, murder for profit, and decades of corruption. The doctor's wife and her lover tried to deny it, but the evidence was airtight. Former employees testified. The bribed mechanic confessed under pressure, and the judge's gavel fell hard. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Clara watched the verdict live from her office. Tears streamed down her cheeks as David's arm wrapped around her shoulders. "For the doctor who saved my mother," she whispered. "For the little girl they left homeless," David added. And for the first time, Clara felt a chapter of her haunted past finally close. The courtroom battles were over. The greedy relatives were behind bars, the doctor's wife and her lover condemned to life sentences. For the first time in decades, Clara Williams could breathe without the ghosts of her past clawing at her throat. Justice had been served, not just for herself, but for her parents, her brother, and the doctor who had once saved her family. One golden evening, Clara sat on the balcony of her mansion, a soft breeze lifting her hair as she watched her son play chess with David. The sight never failed to undo her. Ethan moved his pieces with steady hands, his legs curled under the chair, strong and alive. Each step he took across the balcony was still a miracle in her eyes. David leaned over the board, chuckling. "You're trying to trap me, aren't you?" Ethan grinned mischievously. "Check in 3 moves." "Impossible," David teased, though a spark of pride lit his gaze. Clara smiled through tears she didn't bother to wipe away. For so long she had thought happiness was something other people enjoyed, something stolen from her by fate. Yet here it was, as ordinary and extraordinary as a boy laughing, a man smiling, a family whole. "Mom," Ethan called, glancing over his shoulder. "Dad cheats at chess." David laughed, shaking his head. "Don't listen to him. He's just mad I'm winning." Clara's chest swelled at the word Dad. It rolled off Ethan's tongue naturally now, as if it had always belonged to David, and in truth it did. The man who had once been discarded by the world had become the anchor of her family. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Clara and David lingered on the balcony, the city lights flickering like distant stars. "You've given me back more than I can ever repay," Clara whispered, slipping her hand into his. David shook his head gently. "You don't owe me anything. We were 2 broken people who found each other. That's all." She studied him, the man who had once been nothing more than a shadow at the edge of her parking lot. "No," she said softly. "That's not all. You translated more than a code that night. You decoded my fear, my loneliness, my loss, and gave me hope again." David's eyes glistened. "And you reminded me that even after ashes, life can rise again." They stood together in silence, the weight of their journeys behind them, the promise of their future before them. Down the hall, Ethan's laughter echoed in a dream, pure and unburdened. Clara leaned her head against David's shoulder, her voice breaking into a whisper. The world may have ignored you, but God sent you to us. David wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. And I'm never leaving. Above them, the night sky stretched wide and endless, a reminder that even in the darkest of stories, light could still find a way. And so the billionaire single mother and the homeless man, once strangers from different worlds, walked into their tomorrow as a family, forever changed by a miracle, by justice, and by love.